Okay, so last week Apple announced their new iPhone 13 models, and a few days ago on Reddit, performance scores, Geekbench scores for the iPhone 13 non-Pro models was apparently leaked. So here are the scores on screen. The single core score got 1724, and the multi-core score is 4587. Now, it's worthwhile comparing these against what we were getting out of the iPhone 12 non-Pro model. So just for reference on the screen, it's 1570 for the single core and 3833 for the multi-core. So as a percentage improvement, if you divide 1724 by 1570, you get the multi-core improvement, which I calculate out to be 9.8%. And for the multi-core score, if 4,587 by 3,833, you get 19.6%. So let's focus in on that single core score first. A 9.8% performance improvement. Well, that's not amazing, but it's actually not bad generation to generation, especially when you consider the process change hasn't been very significant at all. But if we scroll down here at the score for the iPhone 13, there's a little tell there. It says the frequency of the CPU is 3.23 gigahertz, where that's on the iPhone 13. On the iPhone 12, it's 2.99. And so again, if you do the mathematics, you can see the clock speed's increased by 8%. So that means that there's only again, do calculations on screen, a 1.7% IPC improvement, instructions per clock, because 8% of the 9.8% is basically simply by revving up the clock speed. So one thing we do know about this new CPU, the A15 CPU in the iPhone 13, is that it's got twice the cache of the A14 CPU. So the A14 had 16 megabytes of cache, system cache, or level 3 cache. And the A15 has 32 megabytes, so it's doubled. So look, it's entirely possible that all of that 1.7% IPC improvement is attributable to the larger cache. So that also might mean that the big cores, which is what this single core benchmark is measuring, that the single cores are still basically unchanged Firestorm cores, that there's almost no design difference, apart from the cache, in the cores of the CPUs between the A14 and A15. Okay, so a little bit more positive. If you move on to the multi-core score, we did that calculation, and there's a 19.6% improvement between the A14 and the A15. We do know that the A15 is built with TSMC's N5P process, which is an improvement over their normal 5 nanometer process that the A14 was built with. And they tell us that you can get either a 7% clock speed improvement on the same chip design, or a 15% efficiency gain. That is to say, if you're running at the same clock as a similar or an identical CPU built on the 5 nanometer and on N5P, you'll use 15% less power than something on the 5 nanometer process. So if you take into account that mobile CPUs, they're very power constrained. A mobile CPU like the A14 can pretty easily generate something like 12 to 14 watts of power, and there's just no way something as small as a handheld mobile phone, especially with all the glass and not metal, is going to be able to dissipate 12 to 14 watts continuous. They can burst at that temperature for that wattage for a really short period of time, and in fact they do, so that you get instantaneous performance. So for example, you might take a photograph, it'll run flat out for half a second and then throttle right back to nothing and let that short burst of power and heat dissipate, and it'll be ready to go again. But what it can't do is run at that rate continuously like it's asked to during a benchmark. But if it's using 15% less power than the previous process, then you might expect to get 15% more performance if it's running continuously. So if you work out what's left after you have the 15% performance improvement after 19.6%, well, it's a handful of percentage. It's not a huge amount. It's probably 4 or 5%. The figure will be on your screen right now. So 4 or 5%, well, where's that coming from? And again, it could be about the cache size increase, mostly because a multi-core benchmark may lean harder on the cache than the single-core equivalent. Another possibility is that the small cores, so the iStorm cores, may actually have a redesign so that they have more performance. And if that's the case, well, great, but I actually don't think that's true. I think that if they haven't updated their Firestorm cores, it's almost just as likely that they haven't touched the Ice Storm scores either. So of those two options, I'd go with the cache having a bigger impact. So the interesting thing that if this performance benchmark leak is true, the most interesting aspect of it is the implication that it'll have on the design of the M2 processors that we're expecting to come out with laptops such as the new MacBook Air, which is expected to debut in the first quarter of next year. And it really shows that we're basically not going to get a significant increase in performance at all, really. I suppose because Apple are paying for the manufacturer directly and they're not buying it from someone like Intel, they're not likely to get ripped off, and cost-wise, it's not that much. So I suppose millimeter squared is the one thing Apple can do to throw out their designs to improve it. I suppose we see that in terms of them adding custom coprocessors into the CPU. And so they'll throw more and more die space at improving those so that they don't have to put as much effort into the primary cores, or they won't need to lean as heavily on them because custom silicon can do those custom tasks like media encoding or decoding much better than general purpose CPUs. And honestly, as far as load goes on modern computers, those custom aspects, media encoding or decoding, are probably the most heavy duty aspects of them anyway. So they get huge bang for buck. Another interesting thing that I'd like to say about this is that this lack of improvement between the A14 and A15, and therefore the M1 and M2, sort of indicates that the M2X is dead in the water. I don't think it's going to happen. And I made a video on that saying so, but I think this is just more evidence. I can't understand why you would build a new CPU and put so much effort into an M2X CPU to replace the M1X when the performance improvements are so marginal. I really think you're better off investing in new cores and new process, the 3 nanometer process from TSMC, and jump straight from the M1X to the M3X. And I think this is more supporting evidence for that. All right, if you have different ideas than me, or you've got some information that you think I haven't taken into account, in the comments, and I'd love to hear your opinion. All right, thanks for listening.